all of a sudden, all of the dreams from the past year flooded my mind. And to my shock and horror, I couldn't deny that the Lord has been speaking to me about planting a church. I just had no idea it would be so early and I'll be so young.
Welcome to Pivot. I'm Terry Elton from Luther Seminary.
And I'm Dwight Shiley, also from Luther Seminary. And welcome to this episode where we're going to focus on the role of church planting in the mixed ecology. And today we are so fortunate to have as our guest Pastor Wole Agbaje, who's the lead pastor of Imprint Church in London and in Leicester in the UK. Welcome, Pastor Wole. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, friends. Thank you so much for having me.
So we'd love to begin by hearing a little bit about your story and the story of the genesis of Imprint Church.
Yeah. So Imprint Church started in 2017, but I guess the story of Imprint started 2 years before that, actually, when I was 19 years old. And long story short, I had a dream of a musical. And it looked like a gospel musical, and it basically told a story of redemption and just the story of gospel through creative means. So there was drama, singing, performing arts. And in this dream, I saw how there was like a theatre production, but there was like a time of worship and prayer ministry at the end. But the funny thing about this dream is that I had the exact same dream for 7 nights back to back. And it was early on the 7th night that I naively remembered that, you know, the Lord spoke to Joseph in dreams. Maybe the Lord is trying to speak to me. So I knelt down on the side of my bed in my student accommodation and I clenched my hands together and I prayed and I said, God, is this you? Are you trying to speak? Are you trying to speak to me? Are you trying to speak to me? And I heard the Lord say, it is me. It's called Imprint. And it's a movement that will bring my prodigals back to me. So I noted everything that I felt like the Lord was saying to me. And afterwards, I found some of my Christian friends on campus. And I said, guys, the Lord has given me this dream about this event. Would you support me to pull it off? And they said, yes, we'll support you. So we took we took like maybe 3 or 4 months to organize this event. And to our surprise, 400 students came to this event and they sat through the production. But the thing that was really profound was that during the time of worship and ministry, I saw hundreds of students literally crying out to God, some of them on their face, repenting of their sins. And I knew some of these students weren't Christians at all. Some of them were just some of my course mates who came because they were like, oh, we think Wole is a cool guy. Let's just go. And let's see what this is about. But they were literally repenting of their sins. And we saw so many people come to faith or rededicate their lives back to Jesus. And it instantly increased the Christian society and presence on our campus. And that's basically how Imprint started. But I didn't do another one of those productions until years later when I found myself at an Anglican church that I was an intern at. And at that church, I felt like the Lord was almost like resurrecting this idea of doing another gospel musical at that church. And I did it. But during that year, actually, I had dreams of being a young church leader. And what was crazy, because even though like dreams was a consistent theme, I didn't used to be a dreamer, but I just started having dreams about being a young church leader. And I could see in those dreams, I wasn't much older than I was at the time. And I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want it to happen. I didn't want to go into ministry. I actually wanted to move to New York. I was in Leicester, UK at the time. And it was my dream since I was a young teenager to move to New York. And I was like, I'm finally old enough to do it. So to my horror, I was getting dreams about being a church leader. And I never told anyone. But one day, my local vicar, he called me into his office. And I think you guys know him. It was John McGinley at the time. he called me into his office and he said, Wole, I've been praying about you. And I feel like the Lord has asked our church and the local diocese, so the region of the Church of England, I feel like God has called us to support you to start your own church. And when he told me, I just started screaming. I literally started screaming. And he was like, Wole, calm down. And I was like, don't tell me to calm down. You asked a 21-year-old to start a church. Are you crazy? And he said to me, so profound, he said to me, Wole, I know it sounds crazy, but has God been speaking to you? And when he asked me that question, all of a sudden, all of the dreams from the past year flooded my mind. And to my shock and horror, I couldn't deny that the Lord has been speaking to me about planting a church. I just had no idea it would be so early and I'll be so young doing it. So that was kind of like the genesis. So that conversation was in January 2017. And I started Imprint Church Leicester, our first plant, with 6 friends in November 2017. And we grew from there and we planted again into London 2 years later in 2019. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about who is part of Imprint Church. Who are the people who are active? Who comes? Who's your audience?
Yeah. So because we have Imprint Church both in Leicester and London, it's quite different. There's similarities, but there's also a lot of difference just because of the context and stuff, and also who we feel like the Lord is calling us to reach. So Imprint Church Leicester historically had a lot of students. It still has a lot of students, but it was kind of like known as this, like, I think at one point we literally had the largest student community out of any of the churches in the first 2 years and stuff. So we literally had such a huge, and we still do, we had a large student community. But over time, even then, they're transitioning where some of the students are obviously getting older, but they're making a commitment to stay in the city and actually to serve the local church community. So we're now seeing a rise of working professionals alongside the students, and also youth. We're just seeing a bunch of teenagers now coming to the church. And so that's one thing that we're discerning as a team. Actually, what does it mean to serve the youth of Leicester? And we have ideas to start a youth club because we're right in the center of Leicester. So we have ideas to start a youth ministry, a youth center to serve the young people in that city. In London is so different. So we are in Bank, which is the financial capital of London. It's where all the money is. It's in the name Bank. So we have literally some of the biggest banking corporations, the top law firms. Here it's called the Magic Circle. So we have a lot of working professionals. So the type of people that we attract is we have a lot of city professionals, and we also have a lot of students as well who go to some of the local universities in this area. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like our core target audience and stuff. We're not like a lot of suburban churches that perhaps have like the families and stuff, but we have the city workers who are trying to navigate what does following Jesus look like for me in my office and in my career.
So thanks for that. Dwight and I had a chance this summer to come and worship with you. I think it was right after your ordination. Yes. That was kind of a fun time to celebrate.
Yes.
And we went to the London location. And as you described that was right on. It was in the midst of the financial district. Mm-hmm. And I will just say, I wasn't sure who I was going to walk in and see in this space.
Yeah.
And when you talk about the two different groups of people that are gathering, it's like two different total kind of communities of of the geography, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so my question to you is, so you really had success, and I'm using that in a positive, right? With youth in college and moving that into young professionals. But now you're starting in a place that doesn't feel like a neighborhood in the sense of people living there.
Yeah.
Your neighbors are literally come in during the day or maybe don't after the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
But they're working folks. And what is it like to plant a church in that kind of a neighborhood with the kind of experience that you had being really different in the previous? Talk about those challenges, but also where were the opportunities?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I remember when the Lord really put it on our hearts to plant into this area. Many church leaders told us that this is the graveyard for church planting. They were like, no one plants in the city of London. So just to give context about the city of London. So obviously London is a city, but there's even a smaller region specifically called the City of London, which is where, like I mentioned before, well, the financial district is. It's also known as a square mile. So it's literally a square mile radius where I think in this region, 500,000 people work in this area. So it's very congested and stuff. But yeah, a lot of clergy told me, don't plant in this area. It's the graveyard, it's a grave zone. No one plants in this area because it's not a suburban area. No one lives in the city of London. And it's true, no one lives in the city of London. But I think the opportunity for us is that everyone works in the city of London. I think even with me, what was kind of ironic is that I actually studied economics, but at the same time, I knew that the Lord wasn't calling me to work in finance. But actually, because in some aspects, it's funny how the Lord prepares you. Because I had that financial background, I could almost have a deeper understanding on how to relate to the average person that works in my parish, in my region. And actually, what are some of the stresses? What are some of the concerns? What are some of the areas that people are just trying to trust God in? So I remember when we first started in this area, especially being in Leicester, all of our small groups were in people's houses because we could all walk to each other's houses. We could all walk to church. But it's not like that in London. Like I said, no one lives here. And the average person travels 45 minutes to an hour just to get to work. And just knowing London, especially, let me use the example of a young city professional. A young city professional probably is still living with their parents or in a house share because, house prices are crazy in London. And actually, a small group ministry is very difficult in people's houses because there's too much awkwardness with perhaps the people I'm living with, or it will just take way too long for me to get back home. So one of the things we said is that actually, if we want to do discipleship well in this city, we need all of our small groups to be in the city. So this podcast is in one of our small group rooms, in one of our church sites. And that's one of the things that we just had to shift. Actually, geographically, we can't do it in people's homes because of travel, because of housing situations. Let's have it in the city. And I remember when we first planted, there was a lawyer who worked nearby, and she came to one of our small groups. And as she walked in and just saw this group of people, she took a deep sigh of relief. And I caught her sighing and I said, "Oh, are you okay?" And she was like, "I don't think you understand how grateful I am for this church plant." And she said to me, "Wole, I work in this area. I socialize in this area. I spend 6 days of my week in this area." And she said, "I'm rarely at home. My home is it's like a hotel room to me. But it's so great that I get to have a Christian community in this area that I can walk with as well in this area." And I think that's the reality for a lot of people, where they spend so much time in this area, but actually they were devoid of that Christian community they could walk with. So yeah, that was a great opportunity for us. Yeah.
What a powerful story. So the name of this podcast is Pivot. And one of the things that's interesting to me is what you said about you had to pivot, you had to change your imagination about what had actually worked really well in one church plant was not going to work in the other.
Yes.
That's one pivot I heard you say. I heard
definitely
another pivot saying, don't go to the graveyard. And you went anyway, right? Like this is known as a place that most people aren't thriving in ministry. And so to go faithfully, obediently, maybe naively or with hope that God goes before us,
Amen. That's
a pivot. And the last thing that I hear is just really curious to me. When you were giving the numbers and talking about the geography, I was thinking of Jerusalem, that we're called to Jerusalem and the ends of the earth.
Yeah, so good.
And what is it about this part of London of showing up? And if the gospel can be preached here, if people can come to faith, like, are you actually ministering so far beyond that 1 mile geography, to use that, right? So I'm just, those were three things that stood up for me. And I loved that piece. I would love you to just jump. Okay, you've planted, you've done some things. Where are you seeing fruit? Where's good energy coming? And how have you kept going in those areas?
Yeah. And it actually relates to the last pivot that you mentioned. So once we started services and small groups, we saw a lot of opportunity, especially with our services, especially where we are, because it's so central because of like the history of this area. Not only do we have a lot of people that work in this area, but we have a lot of people that visit this area and a lot of tourists. So that was a surprise to me, is that we receive and we get so many tourists come to our services and people who are sometimes they've just heard about the history of the church, of one of our church sites, and sometimes often people who are just walking past. And if you were ever to visit us in Imprint London, we're literally in I think 17th century old church building, but we are very charismatic in style. So you'll probably hear like music coming out of this traditional church building, and you're thinking, what on earth is going on in that building? So we have so many tourists stop and they come in, and it got to a point we actually had to develop an outreach team that would speak to the tourists and actually minister and share words, prophetic words, and actually pray for some of the tourists. So that's been, and some of them have actually joined our community. Some of them, and we still receive messages that say, I remember there was this one guy, I believe from Italy. He came to our church. He was just walking past and he came to our church. He came in and he just stayed for the whole service. And I came up to him and he looked completely dazed. And I said, "Oh, are you okay? You know, what's going on?" And he was like, "The only word I could describe is that I feel freedom." And I said to him, "Have you ever felt that before?" And he was like, "No, I've never felt this before." And I basically, got to share the gospel, and I got to just share, I believe this is the Holy Spirit, God at work. And he's gone back to Italy and he still messages, and he said that, "I can never forget what I encountered when I was in your church. I can't wait to come back and hopefully I can move to London." And even more recent, we have a guy who's actually, I've gotten really well connected with him, who's actually from your side of the waters, who is from the US. And he's joined our church community. And I asked him one day, and I said, how did you join this church? How did you hear about this church? And he said, "Oh, I was just walking past the church whilst some of my family members and friends were visiting me. And someone just said, 'Do you want to come inside?' And I came inside. I loved it. And I've just kept on coming back." So, yeah, we have a lot of foot traffic.
So you are, as you mentioned, in a couple of historic church buildings. London has a lot of historic church buildings, and most of them are a lot of them are pretty empty these days, a lot of the time. And one of the buildings that your church is using, where you're actually sitting while we record this, is St. Mary Woolnoth.
Yeah.
And part of its history was that John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, was the vicar. Yeah. Back many, many years ago. But that's a church that before Imprint Church started using it, I think was pretty empty and underused. And so I think it's just wonderful to think about how, there is in the UK, of course, this inheritance of these beautiful buildings and also the struggle of secularism. And so many of them are not being used. And you are replanting, if you will, Christian community in a place where in many ways it had ceased to be meaningfully present or visible, other than the sort of shell architecturally of these structures. So I wonder if you just want to say a word about that.
Yeah. And that's definitely the case for a lot of the church buildings within the city of London, where a lot of them do have, obviously, a form of ministry, but not what it was like historically. And actually, what was special about St. Mary's Woolnoth, I think before we actually took on St. Mary's Woolnoth, there was actually still a really thriving ministry from a local parish next door, actually. And they started lunch services in St. Mary's Woolnoth and stuff. But it stopped because of COVID. And so after COVID, we really just felt like the Lord was calling us as a church that now had taken over St. Mary's Woolnoth as part of our parish to actually partner with some of that history of the lunch services and what the Lord has done with the past, and to almost revitalize it post-COVID and actually for a whole new generation of city workers. So that's what we've done. And it's just been amazing what the Lord has done. But for the most part, unlike St. Mary's Woolnoth, a lot of the city churches, there wasn't a lot going on. So even where our church is, where our Sunday services is, St. Edmund the King, it was known for for courses and for hosting different events, but there hadn't been a church congregation there in over 25 years. And I actually looked. One thing that's great about the Anglican Church is that there's records for everything. And in some of our safes and stuff, and we have to know everything down. And I actually looked in this big, just really worn down book, and it showed that the last baptism in this church in St. Edmund the King was over 45 years ago, which is crazy. This beautiful church, but it wasn't being used as a congregational ministry and stuff. And I'm just reminded of the words of Isaiah, the rebuilding of ancient ruins and stuff, and to actually just see the Lord do that physically in our context was extraordinary to be a part of. But just going back to St. Mary's Woolnoth, St. Mary's Woolnoth obviously has such a rich history. St. Mary's Woolnoth used to be called the pulpit to the world because it was that influential, especially for where the region is. It's right next to the Bank of England. So it was so influential. So you can just imagine throughout history, the caliber of people. So on one side, we have the Bank of England. On the other side, we have the headquarters where the Lord Mayor is. So you could just imagine throughout history that the caliber of people that would be parishioners, that would be part of the congregation in that church. And historically, a very profound figure that used to be the vicar, the church leader of this church, was John Newton, the writer of Amazing Grace. And, this is a song that has traveled across the world, that has stood the test of time. And actually, as a church, we just celebrated the 250th anniversary of Amazing Grace. And we had an event, invited different charity organizations, some politicians, and just different key leaders to celebrate the event and to celebrate the song and actually the meaning of this song, that God and his amazing grace, and how the Lord is still transforming people today. He transformed John Newton back in the day, but he's still transforming people today. So it was a great time for us to reflect what has God done and also celebrate what he is still doing. And John Newton, he wrote a song about God's amazing grace. You know, he was a man who did atrocious stuff. He used to be a slave trader. He was literally involved in the capturing of slaves, but he was shipwrecked one day and he cried out to the Lord that the Lord will save him, and the Lord sovereignly saved him, and he became a priest, and he wrote a song describing his experience, that the Lord, that you would save a wretch like me. And Amazing Grace is a testament of that. And he became the rector, he became the vicar of this church, St. Mary's Woolnorth. And during his time here, he mentored a young politician called William Wilberforce. And in our very back rooms, he would encourage him to carry on campaigning against slavery. William Wilberforce, finally, the day came where he saw the fruits of his labor, actually. And actually, it got into Parliament that we are going to finally put an end to the slave trade, and slavery was abolished. So you can just imagine that these people who were behind the campaign against the slave trade were parishioners in this church, and there were just people who encountered God's amazing grace. They believed in the freedom of captives for other people. So that's the history that we're taking on, which is a crazy history to take on, a crazy legacy, but as a community, we've just been praying that, God, would you do it again? That there's still forms of modern slavery, and we're partnering with organizations to campaign against modern slavery. But we're also saying, God, would you also set free those who are spiritually captives, who are still bound up in idolism, who are still bound up in addictions, who are caught up in their sin and turmoil? Would you set the captives free? We are working hard to proclaim that there is freedom through Christ Jesus in the city.
Okay, well, as if I wasn't already intimidated by living by the financial district, now all of that on top of it, 250-year anniversary. Okay.
Yeah.
We're just the babies over here on this side of the pond, right? Everything's not quite that old. So here's my question. I say that tongue in cheek, and I say that deep in my soul. That is a lot. To say, God, okay, I'm going to go plant a church in the middle, in these old places that have literally ghosts of, if you will, or echoes of these stories.
Yep.
Why say yes? Why go? And what kind of support? And I say that in air quotes, meaning, where did you find support? Maybe not always in the traditional places to do this work.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. Let me first answer the first question. Why go? I think over the years, I consistently asked the Lord, why me? That was a hard thing to even answer. And I think I still don't have an answer to it, actually. And I remember just saying to myself, and actually saying to close friends and leaders, that I don't know why the Lord chose me to start a church at 22. I literally had a list of disqualifications. I'm reminded of Gideon when the Lord said, mighty men of valor. And then he was like, God, I'm the least in my clan. And I think for me, honestly, I had a whole list of disqualifications. I was like, God, I'm way too young. I'm a young leader. Also, I don't have much experience, especially in the Church of England. And thirdly, also, I'm Black in the Church of England. And historically, ethnic minorities were alienated and were actually rejected from the national church in this country. And there's been a lot of work to undo that and to open barriers for all racial groups. But that's the spiritual history. That's the history of this church and stuff. So on top of all of that, I was just like, God, why would you choose me? And I remember being challenged by another leader who's older than me. He basically just said to me, he was like, Wole, despite all of your insecurities and disqualifications, the Lord has anointed you to lead a church. So you could either remain passive because of your disqualification, or you can partner with what the Lord has called you to do. So it definitely took this sense of like courage and rising up that actually, God, I believe that you have, chosen me for such a time as this. And I say so like boldly, but also with deep humility and fear that, okay, if you want me to do this, then let's go for it. And even, I did it with a great group of friends who love the Lord and who fear the Lord. And I remember in the early days, especially, you can just imagine a bunch of, people in their in their early 20s. We used to say to ourselves, we are not professionals, but we will be obedient. And that's still our motto today, especially taken on a city like ours, where we just say, God, we are not professionals, but if you speak, we will be obedient. And I remember just the first hurdle being starting a church in Leicester and just seeing that grow and the Lord just calling so many people to him. But also I remember the second hurdle where the Lord was like, and I'm calling you to plant again, but in a much bigger city and in a much scarier city, will you go? And we're just like, okay, God, we've seen you do it before. Let's trust you to do it again. And yeah, and we're seeing the fruits of it. But I feel like that's what the Lord calls us to do, to take steps of faith. Scripture says that we can only please him by our faith. So yeah, we're trying to be faithful in that as well.
So you haven't done this alone. You've done it with some support. And the Church of England actually has a bishop for church planting, Bishop Rick Thorpe, which is really cool. I love that. And really a strategy around church planting as part of the mixed ecology. And if you could just speak to the role of church planting as part of the mixed ecology. And then also, you've done your theological training, your seminary training along the way, rather than before you started this church. In fact, you're just finishing up your coursework, I think, for your seminary degree, having already planted 2 churches. Do you want to speak to that as well?
Yes. So the Bishop of Church Planting, aka the Bishop of Islington, is a man called Rick Thorpe, and he is a phenomenal apostolic leader. So gifted, but also I just love how he is the Lord. And we actually planted into his parish. So Bishop Rick is the rector of this parish. And just to give a bit more context, I remember, feeling this call to plant into the city of London. And I remember walking around London, and I walked past one of these buildings, and I remember praying to the Lord, and I gasped because I just felt like there was something there. And I said, God, would you give us this building? A few weeks later, I actually got an email from Bishop Rick's team saying, would you come to London to meet Bishop Rick? And long story short, I had a conversation with Bishop Rick, and he asked me this question. He said, well, do you guys have a building? I know you guys want to plant into the city. And I said, no. And he said, would you plant into this building? And I said, 100% yes. And I remember him asking me, he was like, don't you need to pray about it? And I said, no, Bishop, because I asked the Lord for this building. and he's answered my prayers and stuff. But if anything, it was probably the Lord that put the desire and put that building on my heart in the first place. But yeah, in the Church of England, yeah, the mixed ecology is traditionally you have the parish churches. So a vicar is given a church and a geographical area to, I guess, like spiritually invest into and to be a witness and to serve the local area. But often these parishes are so big and so large and in size, but often in number. And I think what the Church of England, especially spearheaded by Bishop Rick, is that we can't do this alone, that it's going to take lots of different types of churches, lots of different groups to actually reach just the scale of people that we have in our cities. So we need parish churches alongside new church plants that might work alongside those parish churches to reach new groups of people. And some of these church plants might actually be revitalizations like we did, that basically take on old traditional buildings that did have signs of life and great work historically, but over time there's not been much ministry there. And that's what we've basically done. So we basically revitalize an old traditional building that was used for ministry, and we're basically saying, okay, God, would you use it as a place of ministry again? And yes, so I studied at St. Mellitus, which is a theological college here in England. And St. Mellitus is basically, I don't know what's the best way to phrase it, but it's a theological college where you study simultaneous to working in a church. And there's a few of us who are studying, but we're also church planters at the same time. And I think the beauty of that is that I think, first of all, you see there's a quicker sense of application. So what you study, you get to use it in your context very quickly, rather than, you first doing your degree and then one day applying it. I think we do that simultaneously. And I think there's actually a lot of fruit in doing that, because I actually feel like, some of the principles, some of the things I've learned theologically, I've actually seen it come alive because I lead a church. I think sometimes with theology, it's hard to see, just simply to see the application of it, and actually, how does this translate in your own context? I think sometimes we can become great theologians, but not good practitioners. So I'm actually very grateful that I got to experience both worlds simultaneously, because I got to have that theological input, but actually have a practical context where I saw theology come alive.
That's awesome. And it sounds like the church planting side of your work, you've kind of been apprenticed into, right? You've had supporters, you've had cheerleaders, you've had wise partners that have done this work. And then you put that alongside a more formal theological education. And my sense of that program is there's a real community there. You had other students also kind of learning at the same time. So you have two different kind of communities, right, surrounding you at the same time.
Definitely. And you said something about mentors. And I think, honestly, if it wasn't for the encouragement, the input, and the prayers of mentors like Bishop Rick, I would have found it very hard to go through ministry. But I think it really took other people like Bishop Rick and John McGinley to really input into me to do ministry in short, basically. And I feel like that's what church planters need. I do feel like we need that community, and we need mentors who have actually stood the test of time, but they are willing to invest in others below them and say, actually, I believe the Lord has anointed you, has appointed you, and let me support you on the journey.
Well, Wole, thank you for being with us today. And first, I want to say thank you for being obedient, for taking a dream way back. It's gone, we're getting there. It's been a number of years now, but seeing of where each of those turns and what it means for this next stage of ministry. I don't think it's by accident you've been called into London. And I look forward to seeing the ends of the earth of how the impact of a church that hasn't had a baptism for 45 years, once again, the Spirit comes alive and people stop in like 2 Minnesotans and come to worship and are filled with not only the gospel, but the Spirit as they leave. You are a blessing to your community. You are a blessing to the church, and you've blessed us with your story today. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Oh, God bless you. Amen. Amen. Thank you.
And
we
get to counter this story with our next episode that takes us to Minnesota, all the way on the other side of the pond, about another priest that has planted a unique ministry in southern Minnesota. So we invite listeners to stay tuned and come back with us to our next episode next week.
This episode of the Pivot Podcast was brought to you by Faith+Lead. If you enjoyed today's show, head over to faithlead.org to gain access to our free resources. See you next time.